For more than 6 decades, Raúl Castro avoided addressing one question directly. It was not because the question was unknown. It was because answering it openly would have forced responsibility into a space where ambiguity had long been more useful. Che Guevara's departure from Cuba was always explained as ideological, a voluntary choice, a continuation of revolutionary duty beyond national borders. Publicly, it was framed as mutual agreement between comrades who shared the same vision. Privately, the decision carried a different weight. Raúl Castro's later admission did not arrive as a dramatic confession. There was no emotional release, no attempt to justify the past with new moral language. The statement was delivered calmly, almost administratively. He acknowledged that Che Guevara was sent. And more importantly, he acknowledged that the decision was deliberate. What made the statement unsettling was not the claim itself, but the absence of regret. For years, historians debated whether Che left Cuba by choice or necessity. Some argued that he could not remain within a system that was becoming increasingly structured and centralized. Others suggested that his international ambitions made continued presence in Cuba impractical. Raúl Castro's words reframed this debate. They suggested that Che's departure was not simply an outcome of personality or ideology, but a strategic decision taken at the highest level. According to Raúl Castro, Che Guevara represented both value and complication. He was admired globally, but unpredictable internally. His presence inspired loyalty, but also introduced imbalance. In a government moving toward consolidation, figures who could not be fully integrated posed a challenge, even if they were respected. The admission implied that Che's role within Cuba had reached a limit. Not because he had failed, but because his continued presence created variables that leadership could not control indefinitely. Sending him abroad resolved this tension without confrontation. Raúl Castro did not frame the decision as betrayal. He framed it as necessity. The revolution, he implied, required clarity of structure. Che Guevara, by nature, existed outside structure. That mismatch could not be resolved without change. What followed Che's departure reinforced this interpretation. He was sent to increasingly unstable environments, missions that lacked local support, operations with limited resources and uncertain outcomes. Each assignment carried higher risk than the last. The pattern suggested escalation rather than continuation. Raúl Castro's statement, made 60 years later, did not deny these risks. It accepted them. The absence of regret was not emotional detachment. It was confirmation that the outcome was anticipated. This reframing alters how Che Guevara's final years are understood. His death in Bolivia is no longer viewed solely as a consequence of miscalculation or misfortune. It becomes the endpoint of a decision made long before the first shot was fired. Raúl Castro's words do not accuse. They do not apologize. They clarify. By acknowledging that Che was sent, and by stating openly that he does not regret it, Raúl Castro placed responsibility back where it had quietly rested all along, with those who decided that removing uncertainty was worth the risk. In the next part, we will examine why Che Guevara's presence inside Cuba became increasingly incompatible with the direction of the revolution, and how internal dynamics shaped the decision to send him away. By the early 1960s, the Cuban Revolution had entered a new phase. What had begun as a movement driven by improvisation and personal initiative was gradually transforming into a state defined by hierarchy, discipline, and predictability. This transition created pressure not only on institutions, but on individuals whose identities were shaped in a very different environment. Che Guevara embodied that earlier phase more completely than anyone else. His authority did not come from position alone. It came from example, sacrifice, and an ability to operate independently. During the struggle, these traits were assets. After victory, they became complications. Inside the new government, Che's presence introduced uncertainty. He did not adapt easily to administrative roles. He resisted routines that prioritized stability over expansion. While others focused on consolidating power within Cuba, Che continued to think internationally. He saw revolution as unfinished, not localized. This perspective increasingly diverged from the priorities of those responsible for governing a state. Raúl Castro, whose role emphasized structure and security, later suggested that this divergence could not be managed indefinitely. Che's influence extended beyond formal channels. He was respected globally, admired by younger revolutionaries, and capable of mobilizing support without mediation. This autonomy made him difficult to contain within a centralized framework. The issue was not loyalty. There is no credible evidence that Che opposed the leadership openly or challenged authority directly. The issue was alignment. Che's revolutionary logic prioritized movement, risk, and expansion. The state's logic prioritized control, predictability, and survival. These logics could coexist temporarily, but not permanently. Sending Che abroad resolved this contradiction without forcing confrontation. It preserved unity while redirecting instability outward. From a strategic perspective, it was efficient. Che would continue to serve the revolutionary cause, but outside the domestic structure where his presence complicated governance. Raúl Castro's later admission clarified that this was not an improvised solution. It was a calculated decision. Che's departure was framed publicly as voluntary and heroic, but internally it functioned as separation. The leadership did not prevent him from leaving. They facilitated it. What followed reinforced this interpretation. Che was assigned to missions that lacked the institutional support available within Cuba. First in Africa, then in South America. Each assignment carried escalating risk and diminishing logistical backing. The pattern suggests that these were not exploratory roles, but terminal ones. Raúl Castro's statement that he does not regret the decision implies foreknowledge. It suggests that the leadership understood the probability of failure and accepted it. The objective was not necessarily success abroad, but resolution at home. This does not imply hostility toward Che. On the contrary, it reflects recognition of his symbolic power. Confronting him directly would have fractured legitimacy. Allowing him to leave preserved narrative cohesion while removing an element that resisted integration. Che's own writings from this period reflect awareness of isolation. He understood that resources were limited and support uncertain. Yet he proceeded. This willingness aligns with the leadership's decision. Both sides accepted the risk, though for different reasons. Raúl Castro's later words force a reevaluation of Che's final years. They suggest that his death was not simply the result of miscalculation in Bolivia, but the endpoint of a strategic separation initiated years earlier. The revolution did not abandon Che. It redirected him. In the next part, we will examine how this decision played out in practice, why Bolivia became the final destination, and how silence afterward preserved the official version of events for decades. After Che left Cuba, the pattern of his assignments became increasingly clear. Each mission placed him farther from stable support and closer to isolation. Africa was the first test. It failed quietly without public reckoning. What followed was not reassessment, but continuation. Bolivia was not chosen because it was promising. It was chosen because it was manageable in narrative terms. The country was politically fragile, geographically difficult, and strategically peripheral. A successful uprising would have been celebrated. Failure could be explained as local resistance and unfavorable conditions. From the beginning, the Bolivian campaign suffered from structural weaknesses. There was limited local support. Communication channels were unreliable. Supply lines were fragile. These issues were known before Che arrived. They were not discovered afterward. The decision to proceed regardless indicates acceptance of risk at a high level. Che himself recognized the constraints. His letters and notes from this period reflect awareness rather than optimism. He understood that the conditions did not favor long-term success. Yet he continued. This persistence aligned with his own revolutionary logic, but it also aligned with the leadership's earlier decision to redirect instability outward. What made Bolivia decisive was not simply military pressure, but abandonment through silence. As the situation deteriorated, assistance did not increase. There was no escalation of support, no attempt to extract him. The absence of intervention was consistent. Raúl Castro's later admission sheds light on this absence. By stating openly that he sent Che and does not regret it, he implied that the outcome was not unexpected. The lack of regret suggests that Che's fate was understood as an acceptable consequence of the decision to remove him from the center. This reframes the final months in Bolivia. Che was not operating under false assumptions. He was moving forward in a mission whose risks were known to all involved. The leadership did not miscalculate. They accepted. When Che was captured, the response was procedural rather than urgent. There was no attempt to negotiate, no effort to delay. The chain of decisions moved quickly toward resolution. Silence followed, not because there was nothing to say, but because saying more would have exposed the logic behind earlier choices. The narrative that emerged afterward emphasized inevitability. Che became a martyr of circumstance rather than a product of strategy. This framing protected the cohesion of the revolution and avoided internal questioning. It also ensured that responsibility remained diffuse. Raúl Castro's words, spoken decades later, cut through this diffusion. They do not reveal a conspiracy. They reveal alignment, a decision made, accepted, and carried through without revision. Bolivia was not an accident. It was the final stage of a separation that began years earlier. Che's death closed a chapter that leadership had already decided could not remain open. In the next part, we will examine why this truth remained unspoken for 60 years, what changed to make the admission possible, and how history shifts when silence is finally acknowledged. For 60 years, the question was not whether the decision had been made, but why it was never acknowledged openly. The silence surrounding Che Guevara's departure and death was not an oversight. It was functional. It protected the internal logic of the revolution and preserved a version of unity that depended on unresolved questions remaining unresolved. When Raúl Castro finally spoke, the context had changed. The revolution was no longer consolidating power. Its leadership was no longer vulnerable to internal fracture in the same way. Time had absorbed the consequences that once made honesty dangerous. Raúl Castro's statement did not emerge during a moment of political pressure or crisis. It arrived when the costs of silence had diminished and the risks of clarity were manageable. This timing matters. It suggests that the admission was not accidental but calculated, offered when it could be absorbed without destabilizing the narrative that had already been internalized. What Raúl Castro revealed was not a confession in the traditional sense. He did not describe secret meetings or hidden orders. He acknowledged responsibility in a way that reframed decades of speculation. By stating plainly that he sent Che Guevara and did not regret it, he confirmed what had long been implied but never stated, that Che's fate was understood as an outcome of strategy, not chance. The absence of regret is central to this admission. Regret would have suggested miscalculation. It would have implied that the decision failed its purpose. By rejecting regret, Raúl Castro affirmed that the objective had been achieved. The objective was not Che's survival. It was structural clarity. This perspective challenges the way Che's legacy has been framed. Che is often remembered as a figure who outgrew the revolution that produced him, someone whose idealism could not coexist with pragmatism. Raúl Castro's words suggest a more deliberate separation. Che was not pushed out by ideology alone. He was redirected to resolve a contradiction that leadership could not address internally. For decades, historians treated Che's death in Bolivia as the result of isolation, misjudgment, or betrayal by circumstance. Raúl Castro's admission narrows this interpretation. It suggests that isolation was not accidental. Misjudgment was not central. The outcome was anticipated. This does not transform Che into a victim of conspiracy, nor does it portray Raúl Castro as a singular architect of fate. It reveals how revolutions manage internal contradictions. When individuals embody uncertainty, systems seek resolution. Sometimes that resolution is administrative. Sometimes it is geographic. Sometimes it is final. The silence that followed Che's death functioned as closure, prevented reassessment. It allowed the revolution to move forward without confronting the implications of its own decisions. That silence endured because it was useful. Breaking it 60 years later served a different purpose. It restored coherence to a story that had relied on ambiguity. Raúl Castro's words did not dismantle Che's myth. They anchored it to a strategic reality that had long been excluded from public understanding. What changes now is not the past, but how it is interpreted. Che Guevara's final journey can no longer be viewed solely as the consequence of personal conviction or external failure. It must also be understood as the endpoint of a decision made at the center of power. Raúl Castro's admission does not ask for forgiveness. It does not seek reconciliation. It simply states that the choice was made, the outcome was accepted, and the passage of time has made honesty possible. History often waits not for truth, but for the moment when truth no longer threatens the structure that concealed it.